this session, so you won't be able to share it with your teams if they're not here.
Try to watch my language. So good morning, everyone. I've talked to this group before in the form of bits. Now I'm in the form of atoms, so it's good to be physically here. So a couple of things. I've been working in technology and in the digital space for a little more than 20 years, and at one point like that was cool, and that sort of makes me feel a bit old that I'm doing it this long. But I've spent a lot of time working over the past several years on the data and analytics side. And this past summer I was fortunate enough to teach a class at Columbia University, sort of up and coming nonprofit professionals. And I wondered at the beginning of that course what I was getting myself into, right? Where the typical student probably hadn't had math or any level of statistics since high school. And I was pleasantly surprised at the end of the summer course of how much they embraced the importance of data and some of the project work that they did. And it also reminded me of something that I think is important, which is a confession to make. I'm a decalculus student. I have no business dealing with the type of data that I deal with, and apparently offering opinions about it in a wide variety of formats. And so I've had to work really hard over the years. And one of the things that I found is that is pretty common in the nonprofit sector. A lot of us come from a variety of different backgrounds. Very few of us are pure data science people, and yet we have a curiosity. We want to understand why things work or why things don't work. And that leads us to wanting to have more answers, and that's why data is a perfect fit. As Tim said, last year I came up with this book, Data-Driven Nonprofits. All of you guys have a copy. It's 81,000 words. I won't cover that much material this morning, but we'll try and get through as much as possible. And for the past year, I've been going to lots and lots of places talking about these trends. And when I was thinking about this session, I'm near the end of this world tour. So I have a ton of stuff in here. Like this is like the director's cut. Sometimes I take things out and move things around. I've sort of put everything in here. We'll see how much stuff we get through. But I also don't want this to be like 90 minutes of stand-up comedy. If you have questions, you want to talk out an issue, let's have that discussion and go from there. Sound good? All right. So I have 3 objectives for today. Teach you something, get under your skin, make you want to read the book. So I'll be completely overt about what I'm trying to get at right up front here today. For starters, the way I like to think about this is, data is the most abundant element in the social goods sector. If we think about all the data attributed to members, donors, programmatic work, funders, all the email campaigns, all the tweets, all the Instagram posts, we deal with a tremendous amount of data. And sometimes I know that can be overwhelming, but it's abundant, it's everywhere. And that data is important because when we can make connections across that data, it leads to insights, right? When we're trying to answer questions like, well, why did that happen? Or why didn't that happen the way we expected it to? And ultimately, the way I like to think about data is the raw material for value. We're trying to create value in our membership programs or our fundraising programs or the programmatic work that we're doing. Data is that raw material value. Now, granted, sometimes it's buried under a mountain. You got to get it out and dust it off, and sometimes it's real gold and sometimes it's fool's gold, right? But it is that raw material for value. And when we start to think about that in that way, we don't think of it as, wow, it's numbers and stats and maybe I'm afraid of that and I'm not interested in that. If we reframe it as, no, data is a way that helps us to understand the value of what we're doing. It's a little bit different. Let me give you an example. There's a retailer you've probably heard of called Walmart, and Walmart deals with about 65 petabytes of retail sales data. A petabyte is 1 million gigabytes. So those little thumb drives, imagine if we had 1 million of them piled up, that's a petabyte, and Walmart has about 65 petabytes of retail sales data. And they use that data to answer questions, things that they want to understand. For example, I live in Charleston, South Carolina, where for the past few years we've had a lot of storms come through. And it would be very valuable for Walmart to know that when a major storm comes through an area, what's the thing they need to make sure they have on their store shelves, right? People will be coming in, we'll be buying things in mass quantities, we have a supply chain issue, we want to make sure we're able to maximize value for customers. What do we need to make sure we have on the shelves, right? So they look at these petabytes and petabytes of data. And when they looked at all that data, something popped in the data. Quite literally, Pop-Tarts. When a storm comes through a major area where Walmart stores are located, the sale of Pop-Tarts are 7x the normal rate, specifically strawberry Pop-Tarts. Because as you know, you don't need power to make them. I think they're better when they're not toasted, and they don't go stale because they're never fresh. Now, if you had asked a store manager or an associate what was the thing that we need to make sure we had, they would say the obvious things: water, milk, bread, eggs. It's like if the power goes out, everyone's home making French toast or something. Right? Now, it is true that the number one item was water, number two was beer. But those were expected, right? Those are sort of, you would expect that to be true. No one guessed strawberry Pop-Tarts, and yet sales of strawberry Pop-Tarts are 7x the normal rate. And I would argue that every nonprofit organization has a strawberry Pop-Tart hiding in their data, right? It's a very valuable thing that isn't the anecdotal answer to a question, and you want to keep digging to find out, well, what is that, and how do we get to it? So when I was working on the book, one of the things I wanted to understand, because I've worked with organizations for a number of years, is, why is it that data isn't as widely used as it is in other sectors, retail, travel, online, etc. Like, what is it? And as a bit of a history buff, I sort of dug back, because I've always found that in general you can find the answer to a question somewhere back in history if you're willing to dig back far enough. So this is where the sort of the journey begins. April 5th, 1905. And on the cover of the Washington Post that day, there's a story about the president making a speech before going on vacation. There's a story about a controversial mayor of Chicago. Also a story about a terrorist who'd been arrested following the bombing. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. But on page 2 of the Post that day, there was a story called Money is Best Talker. And it was about a fundraising dinner that had been held very recently, and they're reporting on that. And at that fundraising dinner, there are two influential individuals you've probably never heard of before: Charles Sumner Ward and Lyman Love Pierce. Charles Ward was the head fundraiser for the YMCA based out of Chicago. He was brought into DC to help the executive director of the Y in DC, Lyman Love Pierce, because they were in a $300,000 capital campaign. They're trying to build a new building. This was a $300,000 campaign, and as with most campaigns, they were a little short of their goal. They were about $80,000 short of their goal. So they had this fundraising dinner, and at this fundraising dinner, Ward and Pierce talk about what are they going to do to raise the remaining $80,000. And so they announced some things that had never been done before in the history of fundraising. They hired a publicist. They had funded advertising through a corporate donation. They had a major matching gift pledge made by some guy named John D. Rockefeller. They limited the campaign to the next 27 days, and they invented this thing called the campaign clock to tell people over the next 27 days we're going to raise the remaining $80,000, and we're going to do all these things. Now, if you fast forward to 2017, none of that sounds new. But for these guys, like, they literally invented this, right? Things that have sort of been copy-cut paste by a lot of organizations over the past 100 years. I'm always amazed when people like to tell me how new things are. Like, Steve, crowdfunding, it's so new. No, it's not. Ward and Pierce did crowdfunding in New York City in 1914. They raised $4 million in a week. Without Facebook, without GoFundMe, without the interwebs, right? Not a new thing. Common thing lately is, mid-level giving. Steve, mid-level giving. So new. No, it's not. This is an ad that Ward and Pierce helped produce for the Y in London in 1916. You've got sustainers in here, £1 per month, that's sustainers. £500 gift, that's mid-level giving. £1,000 gift, that's major giving. It's 1916. I keep going with these over and over and over. Not a new concept, right? So get over it, right? They invented a lot of this stuff, right? Between 1905 and 1923, they worked with a wide variety of organizations. Ward and Pierce eventually leave the Y, and this happens in our sector. They became consultants, and they worked with the University of Pittsburgh, the University of Minnesota, Southern Methodist Church, the American Red Cross. They went to the US, Canada, Ward and Pierce spent time in the UK, then Australia, New Zealand, and they spread a lot of these teaching, a lot of these tactics. There's some interesting news articles that they're controversial fundraisers. Their approach to fundraising is very controversial, right? And they raised about $350 million. And if you can put that in today's terms, that's about $5 billion. Primarily based on the use of tactics for doing things. What's also important to note is they did this without no technology, right? There's no donor database, there's no analytics, there's no Facebook, there's no Tableau. I mean, a lot of this stuff was tactics, right? And if you follow this historical trend, this is one of the reasons that explains why the sector in general is dominated by a lot of tactics-based stuff. It's also based on a lot of tribal knowledge. Oh, we tried this one time and it worked, and so that's why we continue to do it. Well, could you show me some analytic proof of why it works? No, right? We tried it, we did it, it worked. Move along, right? You see this sort of trend follow through history, right? Now, if you compare similar sort of time horizons in other areas, you get sort of a little bit of a different result. So this is January 7th, 1954, and IBM and Georgetown University did this experiment. It was one of the first experiments around artificial intelligence and natural language processing. So this amazing computer that they set up at Georgetown from the folks at IBM, and they fed it 60 Russian phrases. They had someone sit at a keyboard and they would type in these phrases in Russian so they wouldn't know what they meant, and it would produce a punch card. They would feed that punch card into the machine and it would translate the phrase. And they were 60 for 60. They wrote in 60 phrases in Russian, they got almost the exact same phrase back in English, right? And the guy at Georgetown was heading the program, Leon Dostert, said, you know, this is miraculous, and in just a few years, we will solve this whole issue. Computers will be able to translate just about any language in just a few years. It's just around the corner. But then when they tried different phrases in later tests, they ran into some problems. So for example, they said this phrase, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And the result they got back from the computer is the vodka is good, meat is rough. Not an exact translation. But if you think about where we are today, think about Siri, Alexa, all the digital assistants you use, anything you do by a voice command. Well, not perfect. It's pretty damn good now, right? Like, we've solved that issue of being able to do voice to text types of translation, right? Over a 50-year period of time. Technology eventually figures this stuff out. Another point of comparison, July 20th, 1969, Neil and Buzz land on the moon, and they do this using the Apollo guidance computer. So it was the most sophisticated piece of technical equipment mankind had ever invented up until then. It cost about $150,000 to make. They only made a few of them. Actually, the original one is lost somewhere on the moon at the moment. And it had 64 kilobytes of memory, right? And if you remember, Neil had to take over right towards the end because the computer got overloaded, couldn't handle all the information, and he landed the spacecraft. Compare that to maybe what is the equivalent in today's technology. What's the most sophisticated thing we've built? It's the Apple Watch. It's $299 or $499 depending on which model you want. It has 512 megabytes of memory in it, and it tells time, right? Again, what happens over a 50-year period of time in technology, our ability to do things at scale, the processing power, all those things are exponentially better. And then the last date here for a point of comparison is October 23rd, 1997. And at a conference in Phoenix, probably not too unlike this one, there's two rocket scientists, Michael Cox and David Ellsworth. And they present their findings from some work that they were doing, which is they have all this rocket data, and the computers they're using can't visualize it fast enough. They can't keep up with all the data. And they say that we call this the problem of big data. And this is the first time this term big data gets used in the way that we know of it today. For them, it was a problem, right? We have all this data, and the machines can't keep up with it. Now, as we know today, this isn't really an issue, right? You think about what Walmart can do with petabytes of data, what Facebook is able to do with photos. Technology isn't a limiting factor of analyzing data at large scale and producing results, right? And this term big data gets tossed around a lot. We can talk about the technical pieces of it, but instead I like to think about big data as being the use of analytics to extract value from the data regardless of the size of the data. In other words, it's not about the volume of the data, it's about the value. The nonprofit with the most data doesn't win, necessarily. The nonprofit with the most valuable data probably does, right? So, my 3-year-old knows how to count now, and within a year he'll learn to measure, and that's sort of what we do. A lot of us are still stuck on counting things. We'll eventually move to measuring things and realizing why is that more important, right? Let's get back here real quick. Too many slides. So there's a convergence of technology, there's a convergence of data and what we're able to do, and then sort of we say, okay, well, where is the nonprofit sector, right? All this change is happening in technology and data and analytics around us. Where are we? Well, here's where we are. June 13th, 2017. This is the latest Giving USA data. So giving is an all-time high, although you argue it's roughly flat. I think it grew 1.4% adjusted for inflation. That's flat, right? Like no one's going, yeah, 1.4%. No one's really happy about that one, right? 72% goes to individuals, 8% is bequests, that's just a different type of individuals, so 80% is individuals. Even in the 15% that goes to foundations, there's a lot of donor advised funds in there, right? This is an individual thing. And yet, the thing that people in the sector who look at these numbers like to talk about is GDP. I like to talk about this chart, which is that giving as a percentage of GDP has been stuck at about 2% for the past 40 years. If you want to have a point of comparison there, agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting is about 1% of GDP. Administrative and waste management services is about 3% of GDP. So if you want to know where you stand in things, you're somewhere between hunting and fishing and waste management. So that's good. Now, this would be an important statistic to pay attention to if you believe that as the economy grew, the challenges that you're trying to solve would get fixed. And I don't think there's a relationship between the growth of GDP and what happens in the social goods sector. But deep in the appendices, parts that no one reads in the Giving USA report, there's another stat, which is the individual giving as a percentage of disposable personal income. And this is actually the more important statistic, which is, again, ironically, since the 1970s, this has also been stuck at about 2%, right? And so disposable income, if 80% of giving comes from individuals, and when we set aside the Buffetts and the Gates, it is about disposable personal income. And so this is a share of wallet conversation. And you're at 2% share of wallet. And you're competing with the new iPhone and the iWatch and my Netflix subscription. We actually published some research on this recently that dug into factors you can look at that are identifiers for how we increase our share of wallet. And it's things like age, education, household composition. But again, when you know this now, you say, wow, what's our share of wallet? If I could get our share of wallet from 2% to 3% to 5%, what would that mean? It may change how you think about things. We also know last year, first year donor retention was 29%, and the internet's worse, despite being better. First year online donor retention is 21%. Now what's also interesting is, if you look at multi-year donor retention across both of these channels, you get up to like 60%. And yet, how many organizations are really super focused on that first gift when you know that if I can get you to that second gift, the numbers exponentially move in my favor? And so when I talk to organizations about this part, it's like, go back to your offices and have a meeting and talk about what if it was all about the second gift? Forget the first gift. The first gift is table stakes. What if it was all about the second gift? What if we geared our program around the frequency of that gift and how that gift comes in, and we focus so much of our energy not on the first gift, but on the second gift? What might we do different? So the sector has a bit of a problem And my suggestion for solving this is more use of data and analytics, certainly. I'm also a big believer that throwing more people at the problem doesn't scale. I'm not big on effectiveness. Effectiveness means usually do more with less, or sort of efficiency is more about doing more with less, right? And so I think this isn't a problem you solve by throwing more people at, it's a problem you can solve by throwing more machines at, more data at, more insight, that type of stuff over time. So during the course of the book, I talked to a lot of organizations of different sizes, shapes, missions, geographies, because what I was trying to figure out was, does somebody have a monopoly on doing this well, right? Because oftentimes you'll hear, it's the higher education institutions, they are the only ones who can possibly do this well, right? And so what turns out is no. Lots of different types of organizations can be successful in their use of data. And stories from all these orgs are sort of broken down across the book. I'm going to break it down into sort of a couple of big level secrets that I took away from some of these orgs. The first was that organizations who were successful in the use of their data placed a high value on data health. Now, data health being the operative term, and I'll get to why I don't call it something else. This is a quote from Jeannie Pekka, who was at Florida State University. She says, data is a living, breathing organism. It's going to grow and change, so we need to stay on top of that, right? So if you have a garden and you let it go too long, it turns into not a garden, but a home for weeds and other stuff, right? That's how you've got to think about data. It's always constantly changing. The more you stay on top of it, the easier it is to maintain over time, right? Now, data health in our industry is often referred to as data hygiene. And there's very few people who are excited to come to a session at 9 in the morning on a Friday to talk about data hygiene, right? Like, I want to ban the term data hygiene. Data hygiene feels like 45 minutes in a reclining chair and some discomfort. Like, not really exciting, I like to call it data health. Data health is good for you. Data health is valuable. Data health is something that we can sort of measure and show that works, right? And we probably just have more of a marketing and a branding problem here than anything else, right? Let's get a logo. Let's get some marketing. Let's do something. But I want to start the campaign to end data hygiene and focus on data health. And this is really important because if you start with bad data, everything you try and do with it gets worse, not better. It's like cooking with bad ingredients, right? The end result will eventually put people in the hospital, right? And so a couple of examples here. So the folks at Target Analytics looked at thousands of nonprofit organizations, and they were looking at one very simple piece of data, which is, do you have good address data? And not just for mailing purposes, but for modeling and all the other things that you do with an address to make it useful. And as it turns out, organizations really struggle with this basic piece of data. Even the average nonprofit has invalid postal addresses on 18% of the file. The worst is 53% of the file, right? Even death will not prevent us from attempting to mail you, right? So the worst orgs, about 3% of the file has deceased, right? And again, this is a data health issue because all of these things are totally curable, right? Like, we're not the only game in town that sells address and deceased data. You can get it in lots of places, right? Like, we've solved this epidemic, right? Whether it's the US, the UK, other countries, everyone's got some form of NCOA, everyone's got some form of deceased suppression, and yet when you look across thousands of orgs, you see that they don't do well here. By our conservative estimate, it costs nonprofits about $21.8 million a year in bad addresses, right? And I've received some of your mailings, it's higher than this, right? We were taking a very low cost of a mailing piece and looking at the bad data, it's probably worse than this, right? Again, totally solvable. And we're just talking about addresses here, right? We haven't gotten to like really exotic forms of data like this. So, missing phone numbers. The average nonprofit's missing phone numbers on 49% of their file. Email addresses. The guy who invented email died this past summer. That's how long email has been around. And yet, even the best nonprofits are missing email addresses on 43% of the file. Missing ages, right? All this talk about we need to think about Gen Y, Gen X, millennials. Well, if you don't have the age information, I don't know, how are you guessing? How do you do that, right? So there's a challenge here on the data health side, right, that's really important. And I start with this, and it's not the most exciting topic, but when people realize, wow, where are we? This is something we need to pay attention to, because everything else you want to do with data sort of is hampered by if you start with bad stuff to begin with. And as I've dug into this, I sort of think of data health as there's sort of three legs to the stool, if you will. There's data quality, so things like, do we have correct address information, right? If we mail something, if we screen something, is it correct, right? That's one component. There's also a data completeness issue, which is, do we have age information? Do we have congressional district? Do we know that they give to political campaigns? Do we know if they're active on social media? That's a completeness issue, right? You're trying to fill in that profile of that individual. And I would say that most data health, probably 90% or 90 to 95% of data health are quality and completeness issues. And then the third item, it's about 5% of it, is design. And yet this is where all the focus is. And, data design is a nice way of saying, well, you know, when Bob was putting information in the system, he didn't like the first class field, so he created a set of custom fields to stick that data, and that's why we can't report on it. Oh, that's unfortunate. We should talk to Bob and see how we can fix that. Oh, Bob doesn't work here anymore. That's a data design issue. Or sometimes software vendors do things that we would say, it's working as designed. Like, it's one of our favorite phrases as software developers. It's working as designed. Like, no, it's not working. It may be designed, but it's not working. Right? Now, I would argue, though, that only about 5% of this data health stuff are design issues, and yet they're always brought up as the reason why we can't do something. Oh, well, you know, it's legacy data. Oh, it was improperly put in. We've had issues over time. Versus thinking about quality, completeness, sort of how do we attack that over time to get better at things. Let me give you an example. So, my last name gets misspelled all the time, right? And our chief scientist, Chuck Longfield, dug into this a few years ago to find out, well, what does misspelling someone's name cost you? It must cost something. So, as many of you know, Chuck likes to dig into data and answer these sort of out there questions. And what he found was that when you misspell a donor's name, it costs you about 10% in retention, and those who don't stop giving to you give you about 12% less. So now you know, what does a typo cost you? So now you can go to your vice president of typos and tell them that they need to work on this problem. Except organizations don't have vice presidents of typos, right? Not yet. And so it's an organizational thing, right? There are things like this that aren't a quick fix. It's a cultural thing. It's, okay, do we believe in the importance of data quality? Yes, okay? What are we gonna do about typos? Because now you know typos actually do cost you something. You probably wanna fix that. Well, it's a cultural thing. How do you change culture? It's about building the right habits. So you look at where are all the ways data comes in. Where could a typo possibly come from? And what are we doing in those areas? When someone's on the phone with someone, are they double checking to make sure we have the spelling correct? When we get data from a third party vendor, are we cross-referencing that against something else, right? And it's a perfect example of sort of why the whole organization has to be bought into data health, because no one single person's job is typos. Probably the most miserable job on the planet when it comes to data management, but so it's everyone's job to work on typos. This is a quote from Mark Langdon at RNIB in the UK. He runs the fundraising insight unit there. It's like CSI for fundraising data. And Mark says, the two key ingredients are in fact good insight analysts and good data governance, because the right people can't do anything unless the quality of data is high, right? If you're going to invest in people and you're going to invest in technology to do things with the data, if the quality of the data isn't high, you're kind of wasting your money, right? You've got to value that equally. Secret number 2, these organizations who are successful with data have champions at all levels of the organization. It's important to have the person in the corner office, or the person who's the head of the organization, to say data is important. They read an article, they saw something on TV, now they say data is really important, we need to do something about this big data. That's important, turns out not enough. This is a quote from Kate Chamberlain, Memorial Sloan Kettering. Kate says, "We're trying to think about it in terms of surfacing the right piece of information to the right person at the right time so they can really use it on behalf of the institution," right? MSK is a huge institution. Kate's not at the top of the organization, she's not at the bottom of the organization, she's somewhere in the middle. She's got to work with a variety of different stakeholders to get them to want to value data, right? And so she's being a champion in a different part of the organization. Now before, I talked to you about like, what do you lose when you have bad data? I always start with what you're losing. In human psychology, there's this thing called loss aversion. Humans fear losing something more than we like gaining something. It's this odd thing that we do, dates back to like caveman days. But there are also things you can gain from the data. So Target Analytics looked at the same group of thousands of nonprofits, and what they found was, on average, the average org is leaving about $3.7 million on the table, primarily through under asking, right? And so there's some in the annual fund side, there's some in the major gift side, but you have to have champions in the organizations who say, you know, where are we at? Is our data up to date? Are we doing modeling? How frequently are we doing these types of things? Are we in touch with the right people in the right ways over time? Margaret Williams at the University of South Dakota says, you can't just buy data, stick it in the computer, sit back and think it's going to do all the work for you. You have to sell it to your major gift officers, right? They spend a lot of time at the University of South Dakota engaging with gift officers because they deal sometimes with this issue of, I've been doing this a long time, you can't tell me which people I'm supposed to be meeting with, you know, no machine's going to tell me how to be a fundraiser type of thing. She's had to overcome that by working more with them directly. Now, part of this is what leads to what was known as the hippo problem. The hippo is the highest paid person's opinion. It's an epidemic problem. The hippo is everywhere, right? We need to grow annual giving 15% next year. Why 15%? The hippo wants 15%, but we've only ever grown 6% in the past 5 years. Where are you getting 15? I'm getting 15 from the hippo. The hippo wants 15. Why is the event brochure blue? The hippo wants blue. I don't know. Just don't. And so what I found is the one thing to use to combat the hippo is data, right? Is to actually have some evidence of things. Lately, one of the hippo topics is millennials, right? Millennials are great. I'm married to one, but should we look at the data when we're trying to understand what to do with millennials and fundraising? Yes, that would be a good idea, right? Because the hippo these days say, what are we doing with millennials? Where's the fundraising strategy? Where's all the stuff that we're doing? Forget that stuff you're doing with plan giving. It's all millennials, right? Well, the data would suggest, maybe not, right? So we looked at some data from 2015, several $1 billion in giving. We mapped that back to a file where we had appended ages so that we put people into their appropriate groups. And what we found is that the donative population is very different than the US population. So in 2015, Gen Y, aka millennials, became the largest group of the population, 30.4%. And yet, they're only about 5% of total giving, about 7% of the donative population, right? I'm not saying ignore them. I'm just saying pay attention to them proportionally. The reality is the vast majority of giving over the next 5 to 10 years is boomers, silent generation, and greatest generation. Will that change? Yes, right? But it's not we need to flip the table upside down tomorrow and do it completely differently. It's how do we ease our way into it, right? This is why a lot of organizations are focused on sustainer programs, and their sustainer program is particularly targeted at younger donors, right? Because they're not trying to ignore that group, they're just trying to engage with that group at an appropriate level. And younger is a relative term. Last year, the average age of a donor in the US was 62. So like a 50-year-old donor is a younger donor, relatively speaking, okay? Again, it's when you, and the other thing was, the 3 oldest groups account for 76% of donors, right? And it's the vast majority of revenue. Will it change over time? Yes, but we sort of need to think about it in terms of proportions. This is a quote from John Swash at the World Wildlife Fund. John says, "It's not about the data, it's about what you're achieving more effectively with the data." Secret number 3, data is not a foreign object. Probably my favorite quote from the book. This is from Christoph Gorder at Charity Water. Christoph says, "Data is not a foreign object. Data is just part of what you do. It's part of the day-to-day fabric of the organization." Now, that is true at organizations like Charity Water, Crisis Text Line, and some other orgs in the book who are like they're data natives. Right? Charity Water's only been around for a decade, and when you go to their New York offices, one of the things that you can see on dashboards everywhere is they have implemented sensors on water points in Ethiopia as a test last year. So they literally have streaming data about the usage of their water projects in Ethiopia in real time, so they can look at it. They can sit in New York at a terminal and find out, when is that well being used? Is it broken? You know, so that we can decide what we need to do. How do they do that before sensor technology, sort of Internet of Things? They hired partners in country to ride on little motorbikes from water point to water point, and if the one, well broke the day after somebody visited, it could be months before someone would know about it. Now, with that data, they can look at it in real time. Then they can obviously take all that detail, because Charity Water has the GPS coordinates for every single project they've ever done, and they can feedback that to donors. Oh, you funded this particular project? Let me show you what it's able to do, right? How many people are able to receive water? What's the consumption of that? How many people are we reaching, right? They're using data in that way. Now, I also get that they're an outlier at the moment, but they're not going to be an outlier for long. At some point, everyone will be using data on a day-to-day basis. That doesn't mean we're all doing our own regression analysis, for fun in our spare time. No, it's more of, people are using that to make decisions, just like we use software, but not everyone programs software. We have to think about, we all use data, even if we're not the ones doing the machine learning, the data science stuff behind the scenes. And part of this is sort of a maturity issue in the sector. So the way that I like to think about the use of data is there's sort of a maturity scale, right? Step 0 is, do I have data? Did it happen? If you don't have data, it didn't happen. How do you prove that it happened if you don't have data? It's really hard to do. Some folks in the administration are trying it at the moment, but you do actually have data. Then you move up to descriptive analytics, right? Descriptive analytics help answer the question, what happened? Although a lot of descriptive analytics these days are reports or ad hoc reports. Ad hoc reports are just, can I get one more column? I just need that one more column. If I had that one more column in the report, I might know the answer. And then we move up to diagnostic analytics. So dashboards, alerts, reports. We set up all these things to notify us about things that are happening. And then after about a month, we start to turn many of them off because we're overloaded with updates and things, right? And the challenge is most nonprofits, I'd say 95% of orgs, only get to level 3 today, right? And the problem with that is so much of this stuff is hindsight. It's based on what happened in the past, right? It's like driving using a rear view mirror. It's probably okay over a short distance, but I don't recommend it over a long haul. And yet you think, how many decisions do we make today based on reports? Well, reports are about something that happened in the past. And even diagnostic stuff is very much in the moment, right? Versus when we move to things like predictive analytics, prescriptive analytics, where we're looking what might happen in the future, or given multiple decisions, multiple things we could do, what's the best recommendation, the best path to take? So again, how do we get here? So in the beginning, there were spreadsheets, and they were good, right? You could, one person could do some analysis, they could get to some answers. I've seen people do some amazing things in pivot tables, right? But the limitation of the spreadsheet is you can't manage all the data. How many people in the room have exceeded the number of maximum rows in Excel, right? It's a good feeling, right? Like you get merit badge. I broke Excel. It is possible, right? So there's the limitation. It's sort of bringing the data, the ability to analyze data to the masses, but you just can't manage all the data, right? So then we invented business intelligence, which is a bit of an oxymoron sometimes. It allowed more than one person to manage the data, right? I've got multiple people in a system, they can all manage the data, they can do multiple things, except the limitation with most BI is you can't manage all the relationships in that data, right? It's sort of visualization on steroids and some analysis, but there's limitations to what you can do with all the relationships. And so then we invented analytics, right? Because we can manage all the data and all the relationships. But the big catch here is there's actually a set of specialized skills to do it. Does anybody in the room know what endogeneity is? Good. I'm not going to try and explain it. If you have to know what endogeneity is, you probably can't do a lot of this data science stuff, right? You get into bias in the data. Now the good news is that the sexiest job title now is data scientist, right? So you don't actually have to be able to be the person who has to do all this. You probably more like have to be the person who says, here's the question I'm trying to answer. Can you go analyze this and give me back particular results, right? It's not as if you've got to be able to do it. But to be clear, the catch with analytics is there is a sort of specialty and skill set required to analyze it, remove bias, try and balance things out to figure out why did something actually really happen. So if we think about these things graphically, descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive analytics, you know, I have all these shapes. This is descriptive analytics. If you do segmentation, you do grouping, you do descriptive analytics. You probably just never called it that. You thought you were writing a query, right? It's useful. You put all the circles, all the circles, all the stars, but it doesn't tell you, like, could some of those squares someday turn into a star? Can't do that, right? It just tells you more about the thing you're looking at. If you want to predict things, you need predictive analytics, right? I want to know which of my current donors are most likely to make a $1,000 gift. That's predictive analytics. So you look at all the people who have previously satisfied that condition, you add in third-party data, you run a bunch of models, you test to see if it matches the result, and voila, you get back a prediction, right? Now, it's also not an absolute certainty either, right? Oftentimes, I found when people, they have two views on predictive analytics. It's either magic or witchcraft. Like, it's magic, like, wow, how did it know? It put all those people into this group, and this is fantastic. And there's other people like, how do you know? How does it really know? As if when they do it themselves, when they pick things out of thin air off a sticky note, like there's some, you know, science behind how they came up with what they chose to do, right? So there's natural skepticism. It's not perfect. Most of data science is all about probability. We're just saying something has a higher probability than another thing of happening. It's not absolutely perfect. And then what you're seeing now more is what we call prescriptive analytics, which is given multiple options, which direction should I take, right? And we use this stuff in our consumer lives every single day. Why does Netflix think my kids want to watch Thomas the Train? Well, they have a profile in Netflix that has a prescriptive analytics, and it looks at all the other junk cartoons they watch, and it decides it's going to recommend Thomas the Train, right? You watched The Tudors, we think you're going to want to watch The Queen, right? Everything that Netflix does is prescriptive analytics. They refresh those profiles nightly, and it's making a recommendation. Is it always perfect? Does it sometimes recommend stuff that I don't really want to watch? Does Amazon sometimes recommend stuff I don't really want to buy? Sometimes, but it's pretty good, right? And so a lot of this stuff with prescriptive analytics leads us into AI, or artificial intelligence. And in the movies, AI is usually bad for humans, right? Like it's Skynet, Terminator, nothing good in the movies happens with AI. But that's science fiction, and AI is in fact computer science. And there's actually some amazing things being done with AI that aren't building robots to take over the world. Does anyone remember this guy? Flippy. Hello, Steve. It looks like you're about to write a letter. That. Turn that off, right? Clippy was AI, right? It was shitty AI, but it was AI. Right? And if you fast forward a decade, I would argue Clippy is the grandfather of Siri and Cortana and Alexa all these devices, right? How many people have an Alexa device at home? How many have more than one at home, right? This is the way it's going, right? And if you remember back at the beginning, this all started out as an experiment in 1957 of could we translate phrases. And now, I mean, there's some amazing skills, sort of how they think about this, skills you can teach these devices. And it is not going to be too long before, you know, frontline fundraisers or people who are managing stuff in a nonprofit have a mobile device and there's an intelligent agent on that device and it helps them do some things. At Blackbaud, we taught Alexa to do a bunch of things with customer data, where literally I can ask Alexa questions and it gives answers back. Like, hey, how did that email campaign perform? How are we towards a fundraising goal, right? And we don't think of it as like, ooh, creepy. We think like, oh, that was helpful. Like, glad I knew that, right? So artificial intelligence is all about enabling machines to process information and learn from data. That last piece I think is the most important, which is there's so much hype about AI, but ultimately AI is about how does a machine learn from data. So we're back to data quality again, surprise. What it learns to do is only as good as the data it's learning from. Like maybe that's where Terminator came from. That was learned from bad data. That bad data set, we ended up with Skynet, bad things happen, bad movies, right? And AI, there's actually all these things within AI. So when people try and say, oh, AI is this. AI is actually lots of things. It's natural language processing, it's machine learning, it's image analytics, it's decision support, right? This will continue sort of evolve over time, right? And this is sort of techie. But I think what most people think of though is like, well, what's the benefit? Like, you know, I don't sort of care how it does what it does. I want to know, what does it do for me? What does AI actually help me do better, right? So, give you a couple examples here. This is actually some use of AI machine learning we've been using with our products for about 2 years now. One of the things that we do is we use some machine learning techniques to tag records. We have about 95 million tags we've now applied. And what we're trying to do is surface up to a fundraiser, you should take action on a donor because we think something bad is going to happen, right? And so a fundraiser will come in, and this is sort of their welcome page, and we just surface up these tiles. And these tiles under the hood are using some machine learning to apply some tagging that we're learning, okay, what, in this example, a lot of these donors are about to lapse. So we've learned lots about lapse donors. We know what lots of lapse donors all have in common. We can then tag that using machine learning. But what are we actually doing? We're just surfacing to a fundraiser, hey, here's Jennifer Kennick. She has high giving potential. She is, in fact, already a lapse donor. Take an action. And the approach that we've sort of taken is sort of a nudge approach, like, hey, if you can only do, you know, contact or engage with 5 donors today, these are the first 5 you should do. And then when you come in tomorrow, we'll give you the next 5, and the next 5, and the next 5. One of the things that we found from sort of looking into the tags that we've already created, so much of it is no contact. It's one of the biggest reasons why we will surface to a fundraiser, you need to take action on this donor because they've got giving potential, or they've have an overdue pledge, or there's something that's happened, and then the other tag that's on the record is no contact. Because what we find is that sort of that fundraiser experience of were they using a spreadsheet or a sticky note to decide what to do in the past isn't really effective versus the system just saying, hey, if you only talk to 5 people today, if you only take action on 5 people today, we think it should be these 5 people. And when we first released this, we sort of wondered, well, what would the reaction be? Like, when we get seasoned fundraisers saying, I don't need this, I'm not going to use this. It's actually the opposite. It was like, what else can you teach it to do? So I get these people are going to lapse. What else can you tell it to do, right? Which is pretty encouraging. Another thing that we've been working on lately, using some machine learning algorithms. So I spent a lot of time in the digital space, and in particular looking at online giving, right? And so if you look at 4 different nonprofits and you look at their online donation form, you're likely to find 4 different approaches to how they're asking for a gift, right? You get some people start at a low amount, go to a high amount. Down at the bottom, some people start at the high amount and go down. And I've been to enough conferences over the years, like this is like some, you know, debate, well, do we go low to high or high to low? And you know, you can do a lot of testing, and there are organizations who do a lot of testing actually doing machine learning on this, is that your A/B testing is never going to get the optimal result. That what you actually need is it to be driven by AI, and that those ask amounts, and in fact a defaulted amount, may change based on who a donor is specifically. We've also found in some of our machine learning tests, hour of day, day of week, day of month changes, and no one, you're all busy. No one's gonna go and do that. Like if I told you, this is a typical conference site, we found that the 15th and the 30th of the month is a really good day to increase the ask amounts on your donation page because there's a correlation back to paydays in the US. And so all of you should go and manipulate your donation forms on that day. And you know what? You won't do it because you got 10 other things to do, right? And I think it's the wrong way to think about it. The technology should just use machine learning under the hood and adjust those dynamically. If we see a shift, if we see a change, the technology say, okay, I'm going to move where the ask amount ranges are because I actually have already screened that donor in the past, and I know that asking them for 25, 35, 50, 75 is silly when they tend to give significantly more, right? That this is one of those use cases of, well, how could AI help us improve results? You let the machine just constantly look at this data en masse and modulate what's on the form, on what happens. Another example here, something we've been playing around with is, so I'm building out an email campaign, right? And I've got multiple trees for that campaign. If someone does this, make it do that. Someone does this, make it do something different. We've been playing around with this idea of, well, what happens if we learn about things in the data that work better, that you might never know about? What if we offered those to you as suggestions? Like Netflix making a suggestion that you should watch a particular movie. So one of the things we said is, hey, it looks like you're building a welcome series. Recent reports show a trend towards 3-day durations between messaging. Do you want us to change your messaging cycle, right? So you've got it set up to say, delay 1 week before you send the next message. All of our learning across all the data says no, 3 days. Would you like us to just change it? Now, I'm of the view we just change it automatically and you turn it off, but we'll probably get into a debate on that one. This one, we've analyzed your target group and have a recommendation for how best to reach them, right? 60% of your target audience are more responsive to email, people who are not. So things like, we can look at an entire list and go, you're sending a list, an email to 10,000 people, 2,000 of which are completely unresponsive. You're just killing your deliverability rate and your stats. Should we just remove them? We recommend you remove them. Or in my mind, we're just gonna automatically take that out and see if it performs better. And if it does, then we can come back to you and say, hey, that worked better, right? But ways of doing this stuff versus sort of handcrafted. Like, I don't think anyone really enjoys spending all day or all week on a bunch of email segmentation stuff, right? You've got lots of other things to do. Can the machines help you do some of it faster? The other thing that we've been looking at as well is, all this stuff has to be able to function at some level of scale, right? And so you're dealing with thousands, tens of thousands, or millions of supporters, and yet what you want to be able to do is treat them and engage with them on an individual level, but you have to be able to do it at scale. Sort of without scale, it's really hard to do, right? And so, we can today take a supporter and we can tell you who they are, why they give, who else they give to, where they give, what channels they engage with, where are they responsive to. We can tell you all of these things, right? And this is a lot of descriptive analytics, and I know you guys have penned a lot of this type of stuff. So this isn't necessarily a new concept, although we keep adding new things. Like we can now tell you things like, does this person engage through personal crowdfunding, peer-to-peer fundraising, right? As opposed to just direct mail and TV and telephone. Like we can give you some insights on the digital channels. But for us, what would be interesting is to not only take what are the things that we know about an individual, but also extend that to, well, what do you know about that individual and who that individual engages with over time, right? We've done some really interesting work here, in particular in peer-to-peer, where we find out things like people who give to a crowdfunding campaign. Well, what about the people that they share that message with on Facebook or Twitter? What about people who also donate to that crowdfunding campaign? What do we know about them? And pretty soon you sort of get this extended network view, that it isn't just about the individual, that it's also about that person's extended network and who are they engaged with, right? And you could take this and get to very high scale of really trying to almost understand what's the ecosystem of an individual donor. Well, that ecosystem of an individual donor isn't just, you know, Jane, the individual donor. Her ecosystem actually has a reach of 25,000 people. If you think about all of her social contacts or professional contacts, who she engages with, it gets much bigger, right? And that's an area we're very interested in exploring from a data perspective. Like, is this a way to bring in brand new people from an acquisition standpoint or from an engagement standpoint, because there's some degree of separation from someone who's already engaged with the cause, right? And again, like, you can't do this without sort of the AI, the machine learning, the ability to do it at scale. Like, you can't do it in a spreadsheet. It's just impossible, right? And so thankfully some of the technology allows you to get there at scale. Roger Craver, the agitator, said, it's no longer who has the biggest database, it's who has the most valuable database. This is the third different way I've attempted to say this. So repetition, repetition. Secret number 4, nonprofits who are good with data are good storytellers. I think it's interesting that all good stories have data in them. You ever notice this? 3 little pigs, little dogs, 3 little bears. Am I the only one who's been reading a lot of bedtime stories lately? So this is Bob Philbin. He's the chief data scientist at Crisis TechSign. Bob says, data storytelling not only leads to organizational change, but it reinforces and reinvigorates that underlying data culture. When Nancy Loveland started Crisis TechSign, this is her 3rd nonprofit she's worked with, by the way, her first 2 hires were a chief technology officer and a chief data scientist, because their mission is data. They deal with millions of text messages, right? And one of the things I've gotten to know from talking with Bob is his big belief is he understands the data side. His job now is being able to tell stories with data, right? How to get people to tell a story, to see what's happening, and use data as a part of that storytelling. Now the challenge we reach here is oftentimes think so the facts speak for themselves. This is a quote from a book. Ordinarily, facts do not speak for themselves. When they do speak for themselves, the wrong conclusions are often drawn from them. Again, this isn't new. This is from a book by Willard Britton in 1914 called Graphical Methods for Presenting Facts. It's a fascinating read. Basically, he figured out why most pie charts are bad back in 1914. Right? It's how we present information, how people consume information that's really important, because the data doesn't speak for itself. Just because Excel and PowerPoint let you do it doesn't mean that you should, right? As you can see in the fuchsia shaded section, we've literally got, I was at Stanford earlier this year, and we were talking about this topic, and somebody in the audience asked, hey, should we use a tornado chart to represent something we found? I'm like, stop. Like, I know we're at Stanford, and maybe a lot of you are using tornado charts, but no, don't ever use a tornado chart. There's like 3 people in the room who understand how that works, right? It's a challenge, right? And so we see these examples of how data is used or misused all the time. This is a social media post from the National Review. The only climate chart you need to see. So you would look at this and go, wow, I don't see climate change. But it's bad data visualization, right? It's sort of like lying with statistics. Here's the actual chart. Now what's the difference? You notice they changed the X and the Y axis, so they spread it out so it doesn't look like there's a major change. But if you actually zero in and go, wow, there is actually change here. But this is sort of cheating the data, right? And this is what it actually looks like. Tells 2 very different stories, depending on how you represent the data. This was a pretty well-known chart from 2015 from an organization who wasn't exactly a fan of Planned Parenthood, and they were attempting to tell a story about how screenings for breast cancer were going down and abortions were going up, except it's a total misrepresentation of the data. Here's the actual chart. They sort of just ignored to actually use the right X and Y axes. But again, people take data and sort of misrepresent truth with data because you can. Another way of looking at that data as well, right? And I bring this up because how you represent, how you show data, you're telling a story, and you want to make sure that you get that part of it right. Last year I was working with an organization, and we were looking at sort of multi-channel giving across a bunch of channels, and they kept talking about how their online giving had been up 21%. And after about the 5th time that they said it was up 21%, I had to sort of stop them and say, I'm confused, like, is that good? Are you happy with that? Like, I have no context. You seem proud of 21%, I don't know what it means. Here's how they could have used visualization to tell that story differently, using what I think is one of the best data visualizations, called a bullet chart. And I'm gonna break down the bullet chart for you. Bullet chart has everything. On the bottom, there's a quantitative scale. In this case, we're going from 0% to 35%. That makes the quantitative people in the room happy, right? The finance people will be happy. There's actually numbers and a scale. There is a qualitative range. Red is bad, yellow is not so bad, green is good for the qualitative folks who are off in the room, who may not care about the number, but they want to know, is this good? Is this bad, right? And then there's the bullet, which is actual performance, goes up to 21%. But the key piece here is there's another line that goes to the bullet chart, which is target performance, right? So in one little chart, I can tell lots of stories, right? I can say, last year, our online giving growth was 21%. It was good, but it was short of our 27% goal. Maybe when we're setting next year's goal, we will take that into account, right? All really simple. And there are tools out there like Tableau and others that will let you do these bullet charts. I've even seen someone sort of coerce Excel to generate these too. I just made this in PowerPoint. This is like 3 rectangles and a line. Like, you can fake it till you make it. Like, sometimes, I would challenge you the next week, go to a meeting, take one thing you were normally presenting and do it as a bullet chart. And be like, wow, that's a really cool thing. And then they'll want you to do it with everything. So, you're welcome. Secret number 5, this is the last secret. Secret number 5 is culture. This is a quote from Peter Drucker. He said, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and it eats data strategy for lunch. You can have an emphasis on data health. You can have champions at all levels of the organizations. You can really focus on it, but culture is a huge impact. Half the book is about culture stuff. Because what I found was, this isn't about like, do you have the right tools, and is it R or SAS or SPSS? Like, it's none of that stuff. It is, a lot of this is so much about culture. And what I found was, at least in this first edition, there's about 7 different culture types that I was able to identify. And the good news is that you can be any of these culture types and still be successful with data. There's this term called equifinality, which is there are multiple ways to reach the same result. And what I found is these organizations had different culture types, but were successful with data. We know that in public media, there's a culture of sharing that's been around for 2 decades. You share data, lots of it. Guess what? Not every organization does that, right? Great example in the book, in World Wildlife Fund, they don't have a culture of sharing. They're a very siloed organization, but they have culture of testing. They test lots of stuff. And a culture of testing allowed them to say, hey, we heard you tested that. Could you test this? Sure, we'll try that. Like, there's multiple ways to get there. I'll share a couple quick examples. This example is from here in Denver, that's in the book. This is Griff Frischlag. He's the Vice President of Development at the Denver Rescue Mission. He spent decades in banking before he went to Denver Rescue Mission. Really fascinating guy. And Griff says, one of the misnomers in fundraising is that you just need to find a good salesman. I don't think anything could be further from the truth. He and what they've done at Denver Rescue Mission is a culture on growth. They look at the numbers, they have KPIs, they think about how do we grow what we're doing, how do we improve the things that we're doing. It's a growth mindset, it is a culture of growth. And what's interesting is, historically, Denver Rescue Mission was founded in 1892. And up until 1987, they were a staff of 4 and about 200K, a budget of 200K. 2015, they had a budget of $30 million. Like, this chart isn't clearly drawn to scale because it would be so much bigger. And a lot of that change has been driven by Griff and some of the people that he has brought in to sort of have this growth mindset of what are we trying to do? How are we trying to improve results? You know, everyone has opinions, but let's look at the data. And so it leads them to doing things like, let's experiment with our online giving. Like, well, you have an ask amount of $86.40? Well, how did you come up with that? We tested it, we found it worked. We do think, we're looking for growth, we're looking to improve things. One of the things he talks about in the book is they think there's a huge planned gift opportunity for the organization. Like they think they could get $1 to $2 million annually in sustained planned giving growth. That they know, but it's a mindset, like we know it's out there, we just have to figure out a way to go get it, as opposed to a mindset of, yeah, it is what it is, we can't improve what we're doing, right? But it's a definite culture type, and not every organization has that culture type, but it's certainly true at Denver Rescue Mission. We'll bring back our friend Margaret Williams. This is the University of South Dakota, and she runs their prospect research department. One of the things that she talks about in the book is they're in their second major capital campaign at the moment. They're raising about $125 million. And when they were going into this campaign, they realized that they had to double the size of their fundraising staff. And so they hired some experienced people, because you need some experienced people. But they also hired people who'd never been fundraisers before, because they needed to grow the staff and they had a budget. So we'll bring in some people who have an interest in going into this type of work, but they have no experience. And what was interesting is they would have these gift officer meetings where people would talk about, hey, who's being successful? What are you seeing out there? And very early on, they noticed that some of the new staff were having a lot of success with getting gifts in. And there was a bit of skepticism by some of the more seasoned professionals, like, well, how is it that they're being successful? Like, what are you giving them? And she had to explain to them, well, they're provided with some of the wealth screening and the sort of the principal gift model work. They get this data and they're acting on it and doing things with it. And they sort of they were a bit accusatory, like, well, where's our data? She's like, I actually give you guys better data. You're just not using it. And what she found is that it was a culture change in the org, that when people saw that sort of the new members of the fundraising staff were using it and having success, some of the more experienced people sort of got over, well, everyone had sort of been sent to meet with the wrong donor at some point in time. That sort of shaded what they thought about that they should focus on. So they really it changed the culture in terms of, wow, people are getting results, let's try and use this data. Last example here is, this is St. Andrews in Scotland. It's founded in 370 AD. The University of St. Andrews is there. It's founded in 1410 AD. It's the third oldest school in the Western world, and likely the future King of England decided to go to school here, not somewhere in England, which makes my Scottish wife happy. And so this is the place we've been to St. Andrews. Like, this is what it looks like. It looks like everything is from 1410. Not a lot changes in St. Andrews. But there's a group there called Worldwide Cancer Research, and this is Jack Cumming. He runs all their digital marketing programs. And I met him probably over a decade ago. And over a decade ago, I was getting this conversation, and he was telling me about this thing called Second Life. We're doing virtual events in Second Life. So if you recall history of social media, like there was Friendster, and then there was Second Life, and then there was Facebook, and then there's all this other stuff. And at the time, like I remember him telling me this story, like, you're doing virtual events in Second Life with avatars, and you're raising how much money? We're raising a lot of money. And it was like, whoa, this is crazy. And we've kept up over the years. They have a culture of change there, which is very interesting given sort of they're in a very ancient old town, and yet they thrive on change. They're always trying new things. Like they were trying social media before even the cool kids were trying social media, which is why when things like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook came along, like they already knew exactly what to do because they'd already been doing it. Right? Jack talks about, from an external perspective, we're always looking at the available data that comes through to see what's the state of the sector. They're always looking for what's new, what's out there, what's something that we could try and experiment with. They're very much willing to try new things, try different stuff, change different stuff over time. To the point where they do a ton of multi-channel, where it could be DirecTV plus mobile plus online, and really it's just driven a culture of change within the organization, to which it's just second nature. They think, well, of course, we'd be willing to try that, right? Oftentimes when we're doing things in the UK market, I will go to Jack first and say, have you heard of this thing before? It's like, yeah, we tried it. Sometimes it's, yeah, we tried it, don't do it. Or other times it's, yeah, it's really interesting. So part of this, again, a culture of change and willing to do things on a changing basis. So I'll wrap up here a bit. Later in his life, Lyman Pierce wrote a book called How to Raise Money. I've got 2 copies at home. And early on in the book, he sets out there are 11 key principles for a fundraising campaign: an appealing case, timeliness, tested methods, competent direction, probably an important one. These are all true today. The difference is, if Lyman Pierce is alive today, he'd be using data and analytics and these capabilities to drive the result, right? And there's a lot of organizations who are still stuck in this mindset of that, fundraising is an art, and we don't want too much of that science stuff involved, right? That somehow it dehumanizes or takes away from the artfulness of what's done. And I sort of reject that. I think that fundraising is an art and a science. It's a balancing act. Some days it's 60-40, some days it's 50-50. But you have to have both of those, because, again, if you want to be able to do things at scale, to be able to learn quickly, you need a bit of that science element. And if anything, I think it helps people to be more artful, in part because without science, there could be no art. Right? We need this balance of things to be successful. Thanks for your time. I'm happy to take questions or answers if you've got either of them.
And crickets.
Crickets.
It's that Friday morning crickets.
Great, thanks for having me. Oh, yeah, go
I have
ahead.
a question.
Yeah.
When you were looking at the email part of it, where you're saying the system could predict, who you should send the email to and who not to because of, not performing. Would it also then be able to kind of take that to the next step to say, okay, we skipped them once, let's bring them back in again. We think it might be time to test this group again. Like, does it think to that level, or was that where you would? Why you might want to include and always keep that sort of, well, maybe I want to skip them, I want to skip them, I want to skip them. Not this time. Let's try them again.
Yeah, it's a good question, right? So there's, how much do you put on autopilot?
Right.
Right? When they take off the plane, don't want that on autopilot. That's a pretty important thing. When you're in cruising altitude, autopilot's fine unless you hit some turbulence. And then landing the plane, you want to turn off autopilot. That's sort of my view of how I think a lot of this stuff will work in the future. There'll be points where, it's turned on, but if you hit some turbulence or you notice something that isn't quite right, you may want to disable it. But that's very different than what I've seen over 14 years at Blackbaud, working with lots and lots of customers, which is the default is I'm going to hand roll each thing I'm doing, each donation form, each email in each segment. And then when you get in discussions like, why have you hit a wall with your optimization, or why is it you're not doing the welcome series, it always comes back to, it's just too much work, right? And if you push that far enough, you go, well, if I could remove the work part, let's put the work on the machine. The machine can do that work, right? None of us walked here from the Denver airport. We took some form of transportation that did the work for us, right? And I think this is going to be a mindset change. What we found is interesting when we talk to smaller organizations where the people to hats ratio is high, right? Everyone's got 5-6 jobs. They love the automation. Yeah, sure. It's performing better than if I did it myself, and I don't have time to do the thing you keep telling me I need to do. we get some of the skepticism when the hat to people ratio is low. You get into large organizations where maybe it's Bob, and Bob does the email segmentation. That's all Bob does, and he believes that his handcrafted alchemy is correct. Well, maybe for that user, they will turn off the autopilot. That's cool, right? Although my guess is they'll try it at least once to see how it does. And I think a lot of this would be a cultural change, where to what degree do you trust the results? Do you trust the outcome? What I'd like to see us do is sort of, try and push that as far as possible. Even the example of, fundraiser coming in, they're presented with the next set of people that they should take action on. I'm almost there of like, but if we could actually take that action for you, should we just do that? Like, we have integration to your Outlook calendar. We know when you're available. I'm just going to start scheduling calls, right? For if that person fits a profile who is more responsive via telephone than by some other mechanism, if the machine knows that, guess what? I'm going to start scheduling calls for you. Again, you may go ahead and turn off the autopilot. What's going on here? But I think it's how do you think about how could you get scale using technology in some of those different ways? Yeah.
Steve, we hear this a lot from organizations and some stations that say, we don't have the skill sets internally or the time to do some of the things we need to do in terms of analyzing data or even knowing what questions to ask. But we don't have the volumes to, efficiently in a cost-effective way have things analyzed. How do they start? Where do they? Because they end up just doing nothing then.
Yeah, so there's probably two different questions there. Let me try and take them separately. Which is one, there's the common question of, great, this sounds good. We know we need to do more with data. How do we get started? We talk about this a little bit in the book, but I've sort of become a believer in, you need to find a Goldilocks problem. It's not too big. It's also not too small. It's got a sort of a just right. It's a problem in the organization or a question you want to answer that's important. Like, people would care about the answer, but they wouldn't care too much about the answer, right? Should we cancel the annual gala? Probably don't want to start with that one, right? Should we eliminate membership, entitlements and things like that? Don't start with that one. Start with something else, and then just commit to saying over the next 30 days, we're going to use data from what we can gather to come to a decision about how do we want to solve that problem or answer that question. And you may, after 30 days, say we don't know enough, or our recommendation is do nothing. Could always be an option. But I think if you do that, and then you go to the next question or the next problem and the next problem and the next problem, what you're building is muscle tone in the organization. Like, oh, we did that first one. No one died. It wasn't terrible. Wow, that was sort of fun and interesting. That if you keep doing that practice over time, pick the next question, the next problem, you will eventually get into issues where like you need some level of analysis or modeling or something. But I think there are usually plenty of things within the organization that's a question you want to answer, a problem you want to solve, in which you want to use data to attempt to do that. And so that's the first piece, which is I think do it in steps over time blocks, sort of box yourself in. In terms of sort of the we may not have enough data or enough of the right data. A lot of this stuff is either becoming available in the technology or available to organizations in ways that never was before, right? If you think about address data, like there's, I don't know, probably 30 vendors who will sell you address data of varying degrees, right? There's tons of demographic data. Certainly Blackbaud does, but lots of people do it, right? So it's not specialized. There is an issue when you get into more of you need the data science skill set to analyze stuff. But again, I'm a believer that I think over time, a lot of that work will get done by the technology itself, because we know that that's what people want, or that's the result that they're in fact looking for. I don't think, it's almost like the internet a few years ago, like, does everyone need to go hire their own dedicated social media manager to handle the Twitter account? Maybe, maybe not. Does every nonprofit need to go hire their own data scientist? Most of them will never have their own data scientist, right? Some of them will, but most of them will sort of use the tools that are available to them that have more of this stuff built into it to take action.
Okay, follow up to that.
Yeah.
What about when organizations ask you So should we hire a data scientist?
Should we hire data scientists? Well, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Right? What's the problem you're trying to solve, and why is it you believe that person will help you solve that problem? In a lot of cases, it may be overkill, but like I say in the book, Crisis Text Line, their first hire was a chief data scientist because it was key to what they were dealing with, right? And it's becoming a bigger role in organizations. I just think it's probably early to tell, because also you have to keep in mind that specialty is highly sought after these days.
Yeah.
Like everyone wants their own resident data scientist for stuff. That may be harder. I think there may be other ways you try and approach it, unless part of what you're doing on the mission or the programming side is so fundamentally about data that you're sort of almost in the business of data. You have to question yourself, like, do we want to build that ourselves? The other thing that I've seen over time is some organizations take sort of the hybrid approach. So I mentioned Kate Chamberlain, Memorial Sloan Kettering. They have sort of a hybrid approach. They've got a staff of analysts, but then they also buy a lot of outside modeling and outside data. So they figured out, here are things we can't do, and I can buy cost effectively from somebody else. But when I do that, I've got a team of analysts. One of the things they do at MSK is every week they work through the top 100 prospects. And every week that top 100 gets rerun, because data that they bring in, things that happen may change. Who are the top 100? And that's sort of what they do there. Their analysts are focused on working through those top 100 people, but then they take a hybrid approach in the sense that they may buy some external data, they might get some external modeling, but the analyst work is like digging into those top 100 and figuring out what do we want to know about those people. They've decided to hire expertise for that.
I'm gonna stop asking questions so
Great.
you don't hate me, because I could talk about this all day.
That's okay. Thanks, everybody.
Others, questions? All thoughts?
Awesome, thanks.
Steve. Just